Fog clings to the docks of London, thick and unmoving, as if the river itself is holding its breath. Ships sit heavy in the water, their hulls dark with age and distance traveled. Inside counting houses near the Thames, ledgers are closed with deliberate care. Quills pause. Numbers are reviewed again and again. What moves through these rooms is not confidence, but concern. Britain's empire looks powerful from the outside. Factories thunder. Chimneys stain the sky. Flags fly over ports on every ocean. But beneath the spectacle, something is wrong. The books do not balance. Not today. Not yesterday. Not for years. Britain is buying more than can sell, and the gap is widening. Across the seas, tea, silk, and porcelain pouring from Asia in endless quantities. These goods fuel British habits, British status, British identity. They're consumed daily, casually, without thought. Yet every crate unloaded in London carries a hidden cost. China does not want British manufacturers in return. It wants payment, and that payment is silver. Each transaction sends precious metal eastward, draining Britain's reserves coin by coin. This is not dramatic collapse. It is slow erosion, quiet, mathematical, relentless. Empires rarely fall from sudden blows. They weaken through numbers that no longer add up. Inside government offices, officials track the flow of silver with growing unease. Currency stability depends on trust, and trust depends on reserves. Without silver, the pound weakens. Credit tightens. Military power becomes harder to fund. Trade dominance begins to wobble. Britain's global position rests on financial credibility, as much as naval strength. Lose one, and the other soon follows. This is the unglamorous side of empire. No parades, no speeches, just columns of figures pointing toward a dangerous truth. Britain is bleeding wealth to sustain its way of life. The public does not see this. At street level, the empire feels solid. Wages are paid. Goods are affordable. Expansion continues. But the people who read the ledgers understand the stakes. Trade deficits are not moral problems. They are survival problems. When a nation cannot pay for what it consumes, it must either change its behavior or change the system. Britain chooses the second option. Not openly, not proudly, quietly, strategically, and with consequences that will echo for centuries. The contrarian truth emerges not from idealism, but from necessity. Britain does not solve this crisis through innovation, fair trade, or restraint. Those options are too slow, too uncertain. Instead, it identifies something Asia will buy, whether it wants to or not. Narcotics. Drugs become the missing commodity. Not as vice, but as leverage. Not as chaos, but as policy. In this moment, economics overrides ethics. Addiction becomes a trade instrument. Suffering becomes a line item. Think about that. When markets refuse balance, power intervenes. This is not a story about individual greed or moral failure. It is about systems under pressure. In dark offices near the Thames, merchants and officials understand the choice clearly. Either Britain continues losing silver until its financial position collapses, or it forces a new demand into existence. One path risks imperial decline. The other risks someone else's destruction. The calculation is cold but simple. Moral cost is cheaper than economic collapse. And so, the machinery begins to turn. Narcotics offer something rare in trade. Guaranteed demand once dependence takes hold. Unlike manufactured goods, addiction does not require persuasion or innovation. It feeds itself. Once introduced, it expands. Once normalized, it entrenches. For a trading empire desperate to reverse silver outflows, this is not temptation. It is solution. Drugs can flow east while silver flows west. The imbalance reverses. The books begin to stabilize. The pound breathes easier. Britain's financial bleeding slows. On paper, the problem is solved. But solutions that work on paper often hide costs elsewhere. Those costs do not appear in British ledgers. They do not show up in London streets or factory floors. They accumulate far away, in places that do not vote, do not publish editorials, and do not sit in Parliament. This distance makes the policy easier to accept. Out of sight becomes out of conscience. Empire thrives on distance like this. It allows actions that would be intolerable at home to feel abstract abroad. The shift does not announce itself with declarations or debates. It unfolds through contracts, shipping schedules, and administrative routines. The empire does what it always does. It organizes. It measures. It regulates. Narcotics are not treated as scandal, but as cargo. Quantities are standardized. Routes are secured. Risks are calculated. Insurance is written. The trade is absorbed into the imperial system with bureaucratic efficiency. What begins as emergency response quickly becomes normalized practice. This normalization is what makes the story dangerous. Once a morally extreme action proves economically effective, it gains defenders. Success quiets dissent. Balanced accounts create confidence. Confidence delays scrutiny. Britain's trade deficit begins to narrow. Silver returns. Financial panic recedes. To those in power, the outcome justifies a method. After all, the empire remains stable. Factories continue running. The fleet remains funded. The alternative, they tell themselves, would have been worse. Yet beneath the surface, the stakes grow higher with every shipment. Britain is no longer just trading goods. It is trading consequences. Addiction does not stay contained. It reshapes societies. It destabilizes markets. It creates resentment that cannot be taxed away or suppressed indefinitely. Each success deepens dependency, not only for those consuming the drugs, but for Britain itself. The empire's financial health becomes tied to continued harm elsewhere. To stop would mean reopening the deficit. To continue means escalation. This is a trap forming in real time. Britain does not merely use narcotics to balance trade. It restructures its economy around them. Revenue streams become dependent. Administrative systems adapt. Expectations harden. What was once an emergency measure becomes structural necessity. The empire's books now assume this flow will continue. Interruptions are no longer inconveniences. They are threats, and threats invite force. The central question begins to loom, even if it is not spoken aloud. How far will a global empire go to keep its books balanced? Will it negotiate when challenged or compel compliance? Will it adjust its consumption or enforce its supply? These questions sit silently behind every ledger entry. They will soon demand answers not in ink, but in iron and fire. For now, Britain appears to have solved its problem. The trade deficit recedes. Financial stability returns. Confidence spreads. The empire marches forward, convinced it has outsmarted the limits of trade. But the fog over London's docks does not lift. It thickens, because this solution carries a price that cannot be deferred forever. The numbers may balance, but the system is no longer stable. It is brittle, and brittle systems do not bend when pressure returns. They break. This is where the story truly begins. Not with collapse, but with a choice. A choice to treat economics as destiny and morality as optional. A choice to preserve power at any cost. Britain makes that choice deliberately, quietly, and with full awareness of what is at stake. The empire survives a moment, but survival achieved this way leaves marks. And those marks will shape everything that follows. For now, the ledgers close with cleaner columns. The silver flows back. The docks remain busy. Britain believes it has secured its future. It does not yet see that it has also written the terms of its reckoning. To understand why this strategy even seemed possible, it is necessary to step back and look at the illusion Britain projected to the world and to itself. From the outside, the empire appears unshakable. Smoke rises endlessly over industrial cities. Machines pound steel and cloth into existence day and night. Ships leave port on schedule, their routes mapped with imperial precision. The pound is trusted. Credit flows. Britain presents itself as the workshop of the world, disciplined and modern, powered by industry and order. This image is not entirely false. It is simply incomplete. At home, prosperity feels earned and stable. Wages circulate through crowded streets. Shops are full. Imports arrive reliably. The empire's reach seems to guarantee abundance. Few pause to ask how long this arrangement can last or what sustains it beneath the surface. Power, after all, is most convincing when it looks effortless. Britain's leaders understand this. They cultivate confidence because confidence itself is a form of currency. As long as markets believe in Britain, Britain can continue borrowing, trading, and expanding. Overseas, the empire controls key routes, ports, and choke points. Naval dominance secures shipping lanes. Colonial administration enforces order. From the Caribbean to South Asia, British authority appears firm and organized. This global network gives the impression of total control, as if Britain has mastered the mechanics of world trade. But beneath this network lies a dangerous asymmetry, especially in Asia, where the most valuable trade relationships are also the most unbalanced. China stands at the center of this imbalance. British demand for Chinese goods is immense and growing. Tea fuels daily routines. Silk signifies status. Porcelain fills dining rooms and drawing halls. These goods shape British culture, yet Britain has little to offer in return that China desires. British manufacturers find no market. Diplomatic requests fail. The trade relationship is not equal, and it is not negotiable. China dictates terms. Payment must be made in silver. This arrangement quietly undermines Britain's financial position. Each shipment drains reserves that underpin currency stability. Officials track this flow with increasing alarm. On paper, the losses seem manageable at first. The numbers are spread across years. But time does not solve structural deficits. It compounds them. What looks like a slow bleed is, in truth, a countdown. Without intervention, Britain faces a future of weakened currency, rising debt, and constrained power. The illusion of strength persists because the consequences are delayed. Factories still operate. Naval budgets are still funded. Credit still flows. But these comforts are financed by reserves that are shrinking. Britain is spending tomorrow's stability to preserve today's confidence. This is the danger of imperial economics. Distance from consequence creates tolerance for risk. As long as collapse does not arrive immediately, extreme solutions remain palatable. The solution Britain turns to emerges from its imperial holdings in India, where agricultural production is already organized under bureaucratic control. This matters. The empire does not improvise here. It applies the same administrative logic used for taxes, infrastructure, and labor. Crops are surveyed. Fields are allocated. Output is measured. Processing is standardized. What is being produced is narcotics, but the system treating them does not recognize morality. It recognizes efficiency. This is not chaos or smuggling at the margins. It is supply engineered at scale. The empire understands volume, consistency, and predictability. These are the traits markets reward. Narcotics provide all three. Once production is stabilized, the trade becomes reliable, routes are established, shipping schedules align, insurance markets adjust, risk is priced in. What once would have been considered illicit becomes simply another commodity moving through imperial channels. The brilliance of the system, from Britain's perspective, lies in its invisibility. The public does not see crates labeled with their contents. They see balanced accounts. They see improved trade figures. They see currency stability. Revenues do not arrive stamped with moral cost. They arrive as fiscal relief. Treasury vaults fill. Panic subsides. The problem that haunted policymakers begins to fade from public discourse. This invisibility is essential. Empires rely on distance not only geographically, but psychologically. As long as the harm occurs elsewhere, it can be abstracted, converted into statistics, discussed in passive language. Britain's leadership does not need popular enthusiasm for this trade. It only needs silence. And silence is easily maintained when benefits are widespread and costs are remote. The illusion deepens because the system works. Silver begins to flow back. Trade deficits narrow. Confidence returns. Britain's financial position stabilizes enough to support continued expansion. From the outside, the empire looks vindicated. Critics appear alarmist. Results speak louder than warnings. Success becomes proof of wisdom. The machinery hums smoothly, reinforcing belief that Britain has mastered global trade. Yet this strength rests on dependency created elsewhere. In crowded ports across Asia, markets are reshaped by force rather than choice. Demand does not arise naturally. It is imposed. Communities absorb the damage, while Britain absorbs the profit. These realities never appear in imperial celebrations. They are excluded from official narratives. History, as presented at home, remains clean and triumphant. This selective vision allows Britain to view itself as disciplined and rational. The empire frames its actions as economic necessity, not aggression. Trade is described as inevitable. Outcomes are treated as unfortunate but unavoidable. Language does much of the work here. Words like balance, stability, and order soften the violence embedded in the system. The empire convinces itself that it is managing reality, not creating it. The danger of this belief is that it discourages restraint. When a policy delivers results, questioning it feels irresponsible. Why risk instability by revisiting a solution that works? Why reopen debates that can unsettle markets? These questions shape decision-making more than ethical concerns. Stability becomes a supreme value. Anything that threatens it is treated as a risk to be neutralized. Over time, the narcotics trade becomes embedded in expectations. Revenue projections assume its continuation. Administrative systems depend on its flow. Military planning factors in its protection. The empire adapts around it, weaving it into the fabric of governance. What began as a response to crisis evolves into structural dependence. Britain no longer simply uses the trade. It relies on it. This reliance narrows future options. Ending the trade would mean reopening deficits, weakening currency, and unsettling credit. The empire understands this. It is now committed. Choices that once seemed temporary become permanent, because reversing them carries unacceptable cost. This is how systems trap their creators. Success today limits freedom tomorrow. For now, however, Britain remains confident. The illusion of strength holds. The empire appears unstoppable, not because it is morally secure, but because it is financially stabilized. Power rests on balanced books, and the books are balanced. That is enough to silence doubt, at least for a time. But systems built on enforced demand and externalized harm do not remain invisible forever. Pressure accumulates where the damage occurs. Resistance grows. Markets distort. Costs rise. The very efficiency that made the system attractive begins to magnify its weaknesses. Britain has solved its immediate problem, but it has also planted the seeds of a far larger crisis. The machine works. For now. And because it works, no one in power wants to ask what happens when it stops. Every system built on imbalance eventually reveals its fractures, and Britain's narcotics economy is no exception. What begins as a financial correction slowly mutates into a force that distorts everything it touches. Trade routes bend around it. Prices warp in response to it. Entire regions reorganize their economies under its pressure. At first, these distortions appear manageable, even useful. But beneath the surface, instability is growing, and it is accelerating faster than Britain anticipates. The narcotics trade does more than move goods. It reshapes incentives. As demand is forced open, informal markets multiply alongside official channels. Smuggling expands. Middlemen emerge. Local power structures adapt to profit from the flow. What was once a control system begins to leak at the edges. Enforcement becomes necessary, then constant. Policing costs rise. Administrative oversight expands. Each layer added control. The trade adds friction and expense. The solution that once promised efficiency now demands protection. Prices begin to behave unpredictably. Artificial demand inflates profits in the short term, but also destabilizes local economies. Traditional industries are displaced. Labor shifts towards servicing the drug economy. Food production, crafts, and internal trade suffer. These disruptions generate resentment, not just among those harmed, but among elites whose authority is undermined. Britain's trade solution begins to erode the very stability it depends on abroad. At home, the numbers still look acceptable, but they are becoming more fragile. The narcotics trade now carries hidden costs that do not appear directly in revenue columns. Military deployments increase, naval patrols expand, diplomatic tensions rise. Each of these expenses is justified as protection of trade, yet together they begin to offset the profits that made the system attractive in the first place. The margin narrows. This is the core economic mechanism at work. Stripped of euphemism, Britain exports addiction to import silver. That silver stabilizes currency, funds administration, and finances military power. Military power then protects the trade that generates the silver. It is a closed loop, efficient, brutal, and dangerously circular. Cause and effect are locked together so tightly that disrupting one element threatens the entire structure. When resistance emerges, negotiation is no longer preferred response. Negotiation implies compromise, and compromise risks imbalance. Force, by contrast, offers immediacy. It keeps markets open. It preserves flow. Wars in this context are not ideological crusades or accidents of pride. They are financial corrections, instruments used to restore disrupted trade patterns. Imagine cities targeted not for territory, but for ledger entries. Imagine violence deployed to maintain accounting stability. As opposition hardens in affected regions, Britain's reliance on coercion deepens. Trade enforcement shifts from economic pressure to military action. The empire reframes these conflicts as matters of order and law, but the underlying motive remains financial. The narcotics trade must continue. Silver must flow. The books must balance. Everything else becomes secondary. This reliance on force introduces a new vulnerability. Military action is expensive. It consumes resources quickly and unpredictably. Ships must be built. Crews must be paid. Supplies must be transported. Casualties must be replaced. What was once a trade strategy now demands constant military investment. The financial logic that justified the system begins to weaken under its own weight. At the same time, scrutiny grows at home. Information travels faster. Reports leak. Moral discomfort spreads beyond fringe critics. Questions emerge in public discourse, even if cautiously framed. Is this trade truly sustainable? Is the cost worth the benefit? These questions do not yet dominate policy, but they unsettle confidence. And confidence, as Britain knows, is fragile. International perception shifts as well. Trade partners observe the pattern. They see not free exchange, but enforced dependency. Trust erodes. Diplomatic relationships harden. Britain's reputation as a rational trading power begins to crack. This matters because empire is not sustained by force alone. It relies on cooperation, legitimacy, and the willingness of others to participate in its system. When those elements weaken, the cost of dominance rises sharply. The turning point arrives not in a single moment, but through accumulation. Enforcement grows more aggressive. Resistance becomes more organized. Military engagements expand in scope. Expenses climb. Meanwhile, the financial returns stabilize rather than grow. The narcotics trade no longer offers increasing relief. It merely prevents collapse. Britain is now running faster just to stay in place. This is the moment when the hidden liability becomes visible. What once appeared as clever economics now resembles dependence. The empire cannot easily withdraw without triggering the very crisis it sought to avoid. Yet continuing requires escalating force and expense. The choice narrows to two unattractive options: sustain the system through coercion, or dismantle it and face financial reckoning. As this reality becomes clearer, the myth of benevolent trade collapses. Britain's narrative of disciplined commerce and mutual benefit no longer holds. Observers can trace the mechanism plainly. Addiction generates revenue. Revenue funds force. Force protects addiction. The cycle is exposed. And once exposed, it invites opposition not only abroad, but within Britain's own intellectual and moral circles. The drug economy, once a hidden solution, is now an exposed vulnerability. It shapes Britain's foreign policy, constrains its economic flexibility, and stains its legitimacy. What was meant to stabilize the empire has instead locked it into a posture of constant defense. Dominance now depends less on consent and more on suppression. Suppression, however, is never cheap. It demands attention, resources, and political will. Each year the system continues. Its costs compound. Britain's leadership begins to understand the scale of the trap. Ending the trade risks economic shock. Continuing it risks perpetual conflict. There is no clean exit. This is a paradox at the heart of imperial economics. Short-term solutions create long-term constraints. The very tools used to preserve power become sources of fragility. Britain has balanced its books, but at the cost of binding its future to a system that cannot easily adapt or retreat. What once looked like mastery now looks like overextension. The empire's strength is real, but is being consumed by the effort required to maintain an unnatural equilibrium. Clever economics has transformed into strategic rigidity, and rigidity, in a changing world, is a prelude to decline. The cracks are no longer hidden. They are structural. And once structures begin to fail, collapse is not a question of if, but of when. The fallout does not arrive with a single headline or a clear moment of defeat. It spreads quietly, like rot beneath polished wood. Britain adapts, as empires often do, but adaptation does not mean escape. It means carrying damage forward. Policies shift. Language softens. Administrations reorganize. Yet the underlying consequences of the narcotics trade remain embedded in the global system Britain helped shape. Trust, once fractured, does not return easily. Markets remember even when governments prefer to forget. Abroad, the effects linger long after shipments slow or policies change. Entire regions carry economic scars shaped by forced demand and distorted trade. Local industries weakened decades earlier do not magically recover. Social structures altered by addiction do not reset with new regulations. Political resentment hardens into identity. Britain may move on institutionally, but those it affected cannot. The imbalance has already done its work. At home, the empire's material wealth largely survives. Britain does not collapse into ruin. Its cities remain standing. Its institutions continue. This is what makes a story deceptive. There is no cinematic fall of London, no sudden end of British influence. Instead, there is a quieter erosion of credibility. Britain's claims to moral authority in global trade ring hollow to those who know the mechanism that once balanced its books. Power remains, but it is contested more fiercely and trusted far less. This loss of trust carries long-term economic cost. Trade is not only about goods and currency. It is about belief. Belief that rules will be followed. Belief that agreements are mutual. Belief that markets are not merely instruments of coercion. Once that belief weakens, every transaction becomes harder. Every negotiation requires more leverage, more guarantees, more force. Efficiency declines. Friction rises. Britain's experience becomes a lesson embedded in the global system, even if rarely acknowledged openly. Other powers observe what worked and what failed. They learn that trade imbalances can be corrected through coercion, but only temporarily. They learn that economic shortcuts create political liabilities. They learn that dependency, once imposed, eventually provokes resistance. History does not lecture gently. It demonstrates. Borders drawn under pressure remain long after the pressure is gone. Economies warped by forced demand struggle to integrate fairly into global markets. Suspicion toward Western trade frameworks does not emerge from theory alone. It is inherited from experience. When later generations question the neutrality of global finance, they are responding to patterns set long before they were born. This is the deeper collapse Britain experiences, not the loss of territory or wealth, but the erosion of narrative control. The story Britain tells about itself is irrational. Civilizing trading power no longer convinces everyone. Competing stories gain traction. Empire, once justified through order and prosperity, is reinterpreted through exploitation and imbalance. These interpretations shape diplomacy, alliances, and resistance movements for generations. The narcotics trade leaves behind a moral debt that cannot be settled through reform alone. Acknowledgement is rare. Accountability is partial. The system moves forward without full reckoning. Britain adapts its language, modernizes its institutions, and rebrands its global role. Yet the past remains active, shaping perceptions and responses in subtle ways. Markets may forgive, but they do not forget. In the modern world, the logic has not disappeared. It has evolved. Trade imbalances still threaten stability. Currency leverage still dictates power. Economic pressure still replaces open conflict when possible. The tools are cleaner now. The language is more technical. The speed is digital. But the core question remains unchanged. How far will power go to preserve stability without altering its own consumption? Today's systems rely on debt instead of silver, on sanctions instead of ships, on financial exclusion instead of blockades. Yet the pattern is familiar. When imbalance grows intolerable, ethics become flexible. Rules bend. Pressure is applied where resistance is weakest. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it upgrades its methods. Britain's story matters because it exposes a hidden architecture of global economics. It reveals that markets are not neutral arenas. They are shaped by power, enforced by institutions, and defended when necessary through coercion. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires clarity. Systems reveal their values under stress. And under stress, survival often outweighs morality. The narcotics trade balanced Britain's deficits, but it also set a precedent. It showed that an empire could externalize harm to preserve internal stability. That lesson did not disappear with the end of formal empire. It migrated into new structures, new policies, and new justifications. The world still lives inside the shadow of that choice. For Britain, the outcome is mixed. It retains influence, wealth, and cultural reach, but also inherits skepticism, resistance, and historical grievance that complicate every modern engagement. This is the price of solutions that prioritize short-term balance over long-term legitimacy. Stability achieved through harm is never truly stable. The lesson is not that Britain was uniquely cruel. It is that systems under pressure behave predictably. When faced with decline, they seek leverage. When leverage is found, they use it. When consequences emerge, they adapt rather than repent. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation, and it applies far beyond one empire or one era. History does not ask us to condemn the past. It asks us to recognize patterns. The story of narcotics balancing Britain's trade deficits is not about drugs alone. It is about how power responds when numbers threaten authority. It is about the choices made in quiet rooms when ledgers refuse to cooperate. And it is about the long shadows those choices cast. Once you see the mechanism clearly, it becomes difficult to accept simple stories about trade, progress, or benevolence. You begin to notice where pressure is applied, where costs are hidden, and who is expected to absorb them. That awareness changes how history feels, and how the present looks. If the stories sharpen your understanding of how economics and power truly interact, subscribe for more cinematic explorations of hidden history. And if you believe others should see how the past still shapes the world they live in, share this documentary and keep the conversation alive.